Good evening and welcome to the Northern Illinois University edTPA webinar. My name is Judy Boisen. I am the edTPA coordinator for Northern Illinois University and the coordinator for secondary science education licensure. I've been working with the edTPA teacher performance assessment for 3 years. Our science students were part of the field tests conducted in the spring of 2012. Since that time, we have continued to pilot the edTPA along with other programs at the university. I am also a qualified scorer for the edTPA. As we go through the edTPA webinar this evening, keep track of any questions that you may have. I will stop at the end of each major topic and answer questions regarding that topic. You can type your question in the space indicated on the right side of the screen. The topics we will cover this evening will include edTPA background information, context for learning information, Task 1, Planning for Instruction and Assessment, Task 2, Instructing and Engaging Students in Learning, Task 3, Assessing Student Learning, and then a brief outline of scoring the edTPA. The edTPA is a nationally available teacher performance assessment developed by teachers and teacher educators under the direction of Stanford University's Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity, also known as SCALE. The edTPA performance assessment demonstrates teacher preparedness to plan, instruct, and engage students in learning and assess students' learning. The edTPA was rolled out in November of 2013 after more than 4 years of development and development and analysis and 2 years of field testing, which included 12,000 teacher candidates. The edTPA is now fully operational and ready for use across the country. It is currently being used in some form by 32 states and the District of Columbia. The edTPA is supported by the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, the National Education Association, and other professional organizations. The edTPA was designed to be both educative for both teacher candidates and preparation programs, and a predictor of effective teaching and student learning. The edTPA assessment was modeled after the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. As a result, the edTPA assessment will most likely act as a springboard for new teachers to eventually take the next steps to become a national board-certified teacher. Illinois has adopted the edTPA as one of the high-stakes assessments of teacher candidate preparedness in the K-12 classrooms. This assessment, along with other high-stakes assessments, including content tests for each discipline, the Assessment of Professional Teaching Test, or the APT test, and other program-specific assessments will be used to determine if teacher candidates in the state of Illinois are ready to receive their teacher license. Candidates in Illinois will be required to submit an edTPA for licensure starting in the fall of 2015. The objectives for the edTPA include: the candidate will be able to understand the context for their planning, develop a plan for learning, engage students in their classroom learning, assess and analyze artifacts of teaching, identify and plan supports for the academic language of the discipline, and plan the next steps for instruction based on student learning as well as research and theory. As you can see, the expectations of the edTPA are no different than one would expect for any teacher in the K-12 classroom. Asking our teacher candidates to perform to this level right out of the box will help ensure a quality experience for students in the classrooms where they teach. The edTPA is specifically designed for 27 different disciplines. It is a subject-specific and performance-based assessment. As described, the assessment examines the cycle of teaching aimed at specific learning goals using evidence about planning, instruction, and assessment of student learning. The evidence is collected during student teaching and includes lesson plans, instructional materials, student assignments and assessments, feedback on 3 focused student work samples, and unedited video recordings of instruction. Candidates are also assessed on their ability to develop academic language skills in their students and on their ability to analyze their teaching and student learning. All candidates must complete the context for learning information located in the edTPA handbook. They will collect information about the school, the classroom, and the courses and students they will be teaching. They must also document all supports and accommodations for students with specific learning needs. They will most likely collect this information from their cooperating teacher and/or special education department. Candidates must use this information that they collect to inform their planning. Are there any questions about the context for learning information? Okay, I do have one question about, are you providing the edTPA rubrics to your students? And the answer to that question is most definitely, and we will get to that more in the future when we're talking about preparing the candidates. Next, the candidate will complete Task 1 of the edTPA, Planning for Instruction and Assessment. In Task 1, candidates will be asked to plan a 3 to 5 day learning segment and justify their planning decisions. Each subject has a particular subject area emphasis. This emphasis is the foundation for the edTPA assessment and is stated throughout the handbook specific to the subject area. For example, in secondary science, the learning segment must address the ability to apply scientific practices through inquiry to develop evidence-based explanation for a real-world phenomenon. While in middle school history and social sciences, the learning segment must address facts and concepts, interpretation and analysis skills, and building and supporting arguments. Each teacher candidate must choose a central focus for their learning segment. Their plans, objectives, standards, and assessments must all align with this central focus. Let me say that one more time. Their plans, objectives, standards, and assessments must all align with this central focus. When planning their lessons, candidates must take into account prerequisite skills. What do my students need to know? Prior assessment of student knowledge. What do my students already know? As well as knowledge of their students' development, backgrounds, interests, and learning levels. What do I need to know? What do I need to take into account to meet the needs of all of the students in my classroom and make the learning deep and meaningful? They must consider all factors that will influence student thinking and learning. Candidates must use the knowledge of their students, knowledge of their subject matter, and research-based ideas to plan scaffolded, coherent, standards-based lessons and focused assessments that include the required emphasis. Lessons must include instructional strategies and learning tasks that address both skills and facts, as well as procedures students will learn and apply to gain conceptual understandings. This must include procedures that involve using higher order thinking skills like synthesizing ideas, interpreting, reasoning, analyzing, making evidence-based arguments, just to name a few. For example, the secondary science learning segment must include an inquiry-based activity where students employ scientific practices to develop an evidence-based argument about a real-world phenomenon. Plans must also include strategies and supports for academic language demands of the discipline. Academic language includes vocabulary as well as the syntax, the way in which words, symbols, etc. are put together to form phrases, clauses, and sentences, and discourse, which is the formal and orderly expression of thought. An example might be a presentation using scaffolded ideas, graphs, charts, etc. to share information regarding the science concept or practice. Knowledge of all of these are required to use a particular language function in a learning task. Candidates will be asked to identify a key learning task from their plans that provides students with opportunities to practice using a particular language function. The edTPA handbook provides examples of language functions for each of the disciplines. For example, candidates may ask their students to analyze, explain, interpret, or justify with evidence. Once the candidate has selected the language function and the learning task, they will need to consider what vocabulary will students be required to know and understand in relation to that language function and the central focus of the learning task. How will students communicate using the language function and the proper vocabulary, syntax, and discourse for the content area? Candidates will be asked to describe the instructional supports during and/or prior to the learning task that help students understand and successfully use the language function and additional language demands. Candidates must provide their students with opportunities to develop fluency with the language and communication of the content area. Finally, candidates will submit a lesson plan for each day of the learning segment, as well as all instructional materials and assessments. In addition, candidates will submit answers to prompts in the form of up to 9 pages of commentary that will include rationale for their instructional choices and justification as to why they feel their instructional strategies, materials, and supports are appropriate for all of their students. That completes Task 1, Planning. Are there any questions? There is a question about Common Core. It says, is Common Core directly addressed through the edTPA? And the answer to that question is yes. Students are supposed to align their central focus and their learning objectives with the standards, and they can align them with the Common Core standards. In science, they would use the next generation science standards, but most definitely they would use the Common Core. The next question is the edTPA going to distribute these templates in document form for the commentaries? And the answer to that question is the templates are available in document form for the candidates to fill out, and you can get those through the resource library. The people that are in charge of each of the areas at the college actually have access to those materials, and they can distribute those to their cooperating teachers, the students, etc. So you need to ask the coordinators of your program for those materials. Okay, moving on. All right, let's take a look at Task 2. Task 2 requires candidates to instruct and engage students in learning. This task will require candidates to document using video and comment on learning in their classrooms. Candidates will submit unedited video clips produced while the candidate is teaching one of the lessons in the learning segment. The number and length of video clips varies by discipline and is outlined in the subject-specific handbook. Clips will average between 15 to 20 minutes of total footage. For example, in secondary science, candidates are required to submit 2 10-minute video clips, each of which has a specific intention. Teacher candidates may also include an extra 5-minute video clip that illustrates the use of academic language function by students in their classroom. Before candidates may videotape students in their classroom, they must have all students, parents, or guardians of students, and other adults that may appear in the video sign a video permission form. Candidates must also sign a video guidelines form that outlines confidentiality and protects the privacy rights of all students and adults in the video. Northern Illinois University has adopted the video permission slip provided by the Illinois State Board of Education with some minor additions. That video permission slip will be made available to all teacher candidates, cooperating teachers, and school administrators. School districts may opt to use their own video permission forms. Before starting to videotape the edTPA learning segment, it is strongly suggested that teacher candidates secure and practice with the videotaping equipment in advance. This will help to ensure proper placement of the video camera and prevent sound quality issues. It will also make students in the classroom more comfortable when the time comes to tape the edTPA segment. Formatting requirements for the video are outlined in the evidence chart in the edTPA handbook. Video and video editing help aids can be found on the NIU edTPA website under Resources. The first video segment must show active engagement of the students in the classroom. Students should be working on gaining understanding of the content concepts as well as the skills and processes related to the learning objectives and the central focus of the lesson. The teacher candidate should be using strategies that probe student thinking. The lessons should be challenging and promote interactions between students. Students in the classroom should be doing more than just answering teacher questions. The goal must be for students to use higher level thinking skills to develop conceptual understandings. For example, what this might look like in a science classroom would be for students working in collaborative groups to be actively engaged in the collection and analysis of data. The students would share discoveries and understandings. The teacher's role would be to facilitate these discussions. The second video clip must show the candidate providing opportunities to deepen student learning. Candidates are expected to elicit and build on student responses. Candidates must ask good probing questions both verbally and in their instructional materials that get students thinking deeply about the central focus. They must listen carefully to their students' responses and respond appropriately to encourage deep thinking and build on prior knowledge. Again, using an example from a secondary science class, this might involve students thinking critically or looking critically at data, noting outliers and sources of error, and drawing conclusions based on that analysis and sharing their conclusions with their classmates. Students would also be justifying their conclusions with evidence. All the while, the teacher acts as a facilitator. The final section of Task 2 requires teacher candidates to look at the video clips and analyze their teaching effectiveness. Candidates must think critically about their instructional strategies and materials that they used for the learning segment. They should ask themselves questions like, how did my students respond to my lessons? Were they engaged? Did they have opportunities to think deeply and critically? Was the lesson student-centered? Were students able to build on prior knowledge and develop deeper understandings? Were the strategies and material effective for all of my students? How might I change my strategies or instructional materials to make the lessons more effective for the whole class and individuals with specific learning needs? The candidates will then be asked to justify their proposed changes with research and theory. Okay, so that's Task 2. Are there any questions regarding Task 2? Question is, what if a school refuses to allow students to be taped? That's a really good question. The answer to that is if students in the classroom, their parents won't sign the form or they don't want to be taped, then you actually have to make adjustments for that in your videotaping. So what you would do is you would set up your class so that your video camera was only on those students that had the permission forms signed. You do not send those students out of the classroom. You do not deny them the education that they should receive on that day of instruction. You just keep them out of the camera. If you hear their voices, that's not an issue, but if you actually see them on camera, that becomes an issue. Okay, the videos, they can't edit them. What they will do is they will tape an hour segment of the video. First of all, the question is, I'm sorry, you mentioned editing these videos. Are they able to edit them? And I use that word only in that they can clip them. They can't actually edit them. So they may have, for example, 60 minutes of video, and then they pick the best 10-minute segments to cut out of that 60 minutes. They cannot edit those 10-minute segments at all in any way, shape, or form. So thank you for asking that question. I'm glad we got that cleared up. Okay, I think that's all of the questions. So we'll move on to assessing student learning. The final task in the edTPA is assessing student learning. Teacher candidates are expected to analyze their students' thinking and learning. Candidates must use data from their assessments to inform their instructions and examine the impact of student learning. The assessment should go beyond whether the students know vocabulary or a set of facts. The assessments that the candidate designs and analyzes should allow students to demonstrate their thinking. The assessments must be aligned with the central focus, content standards, and the learning objectives for the lesson. The assessment evaluation criteria, for example, your scoring rubrics, should be clear and include both the learning outcomes for the central focus and address the subject-specific emphasis as outlined in the edTPA handbook. For example, in secondary science, this might include assessment for the science content included in the central focus of the lesson, as well as the scientific practices that are involved. Candidates must look critically at the assessment data for both the whole class and for 3 focus students. The candidate will submit these 3 student work samples with their feedback as artifacts. Feedback should offer clear and specific information on the student performance regarding the learning objectives for the lesson. I'm going to read that again. The candidates feedback should offer clear and specific information on student performance regarding the learning objectives for the lesson. It should be consistent for all focus students. It should include areas where the students did well and where they struggle. The third part of this assessment task asks candidates to show how they provided opportunities for their students to use the feedback provided. This seems to be one of the areas that students struggle with the most. They are supposed to provide opportunities for their students to use feedback provided to improve their current work and advance their learning in future work. Both must be included. The fourth section of Task 3 asks the candidate to show evidence that the students in their classroom were able to use academic language function associated with the central focus of the lesson. This includes vocabulary, syntax, and discourse as it relates to the language function. The language function is identified in the planning section of the edTPA. Candidates may show this by using assessment data or by providing a 5-minute unedited video clip of students using that academic language function during the lesson. Finally, teacher candidates will be required to use the assessment analysis of what students know and are able to do to inform their instruction. Candidates must look carefully at the assessment data and look for strengths and weaknesses of the whole class and the 3 focus students. Candidates must use this analysis to address the next steps in instruction for the whole class, groups with similar needs, and individual students. They must also make connections between the next step for instruction and research and